On July 9, 1967, a strange and deeply unsettling silence fell over a crowd of Western military attachés gathered at the Domodedovo Air Show outside Moscow. They had expected the usual Soviet pageantry, the kind of carefully choreographed display designed to impress visiting observers without revealing anything genuinely sensitive. What they got instead stopped conversation cold and sent hands reaching for notebooks. 3 interceptor prototypes and 1 reconnaissance aircraft swept overhead in a formation so fast, so high, and so loud that several observers instinctively stepped backward. The Soviet announcer declared the aircraft capable of reaching Mach 3 at high altitude. Western intelligence officers in that crowd, working from what they could observe with their own eyes, would spend the months that followed trying to make sense of what they had seen. But it was not the speed announcement that shook the intelligence community most deeply. It was the wings. Those huge, flat, broad wings looked to every trained eye like the wings of a dogfighter. Not a lumbering high-altitude interceptor built to sprint in one direction and fire missiles at slow-moving bombers. A fighter, a maneuverable, high-speed, agile fighter that appeared built to kill anything the West could put into the sky. That aircraft was the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-25, the aircraft the North Atlantic Treaty Organization would assign the codename Foxbat. And the fear it created in Western defense establishments was so powerful, so total, and so urgent that it permanently altered the course of American aviation history. It did so, as this story will reveal, partly because of what the aircraft actually was, and partly because of what it was not, and because those two things turned out to be profoundly different. What followed the Domodedovo reveal would take nearly a decade to fully unfold. It would involve a cancelled American bomber that no longer existed, a war in Southeast Asia that exposed catastrophic failures in the skies over Vietnam, a theorist working with unauthorized computer time at a Florida airbase, and a Soviet pilot who would eventually hand the West the greatest intelligence windfall of the entire Cold War. The story of how the F-15 Eagle was born is not simply the story of an aircraft program. It is a story about fear, institutional failure, intellectual courage, and the rare and almost accidental moment when crisis forces a nation to build something genuinely extraordinary. To understand why the Foxbat caused such deep and immediate panic, you have to understand the strategic world into which it arrived. By the mid-1960s, the Cold War had long since moved beyond the abstract terror of mutual nuclear annihilation. It was fought daily at altitude and high speed, in the skies above Europe, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia by tactical aircraft whose fundamental operational job was to establish control of the air. If one side could dominate the airspace above a battlefield, its ground forces could maneuver without being cut off from above, its strike aircraft could reach their targets, and its strategic bombers could execute their missions, lose the sky, and every other advantage evaporated with it. This was not theory, it was the lesson of every major conflict since the Second World War. The Americans had invested enormous institutional energy in the belief that the specific form of air combat that had defined previous wars was finished. The lesson they had drawn from the technological revolution of the 1950s, the development of jet engines, radar systems, and guided missiles, was that future air battles would be decided at ranges far beyond human visual acuity. Pilots would not need to see each other. They would lock targets on radar screens, fire guided missiles, and the engagement would be over before either aircraft ever came close enough for guns to matter. The machines the American aviation industry built through the late 1950s and 1960s reflected that conviction with complete architectural consistency. The McDonnell F-4 Phantom II, which became the backbone of American tactical air power in the late 1960s, was a large, powerful, fast aircraft built explicitly around the capacity to carry and fire radar-guided and infrared-guided missiles. It carried no internal gun, a deliberate design choice that reflected the doctrine of the era. Guns were for a type of combat that advanced technology had rendered obsolete. The Century series of American fighters, running from the F-100 Super Sabre through the F-101 Voodoo, the F-102 Delta Dagger, the F-104 Starfighter, the F-105 Thunder Chief, and the F-106 Delta Dart, had each been designed primarily for specific roles in the nuclear age, either the delivery of nuclear weapons at high speed or the high-altitude interception of Soviet bombers before they could reach American cities. Not one of them had been optimized for the kind of sustained, turning, energy-intensive close-in combat that actual air superiority over a contested battlefield required. Then Vietnam happened, and everything the United States Air Force and Navy believed about the nature of future air combat began to unravel with each passing month of operational experience over North Vietnam. American pilots in F-4s discovered that in the actual chaos of combat at close quarters, radar lock-ons broke when aircraft maneuvered aggressively in ground clutter. The semi-active radar guidance on their best missiles failed when the geometry of an engagement moved the target inside the missile's minimum range or into angles the seeker could not handle. And suddenly a MiG-17, a Soviet-designed aircraft with sharply swept wings that had entered frontline Soviet service in the early 1950s, was sitting on the tail of an F-4, and the American pilot had no internal gun, no answer for the geometry, and no exit from a position his aircraft's designers had insisted he would never find himself in. The pilot who wanted to fight back had to break off, extend away from the threat, and attempt to re-engage on terms where the missile envelope was workable, assuming he survived long enough to do so. Often he did not. The statistics that emerged from this experience were devastating. The United States Navy's documented air-to-air exchange ratio against North Vietnamese opponents in the years before 1968 stood at roughly 2.4 to 1 in America's favor. For context, American pilots in F-86s had claimed kill ratios of more than 10 to 1 against the MiG-15 in Korea, though modern historical analysis has revised those wartime figures considerably downward, with credible estimates ranging from roughly 2 to 1 up to 7 to 1 depending on the methodology applied. Whatever one made of the Korean figures, a ratio of 2.4 to 1 over Vietnam represented the near-complete failure of a foundational doctrine. The American Air Force that had persuaded itself it had made the traditional dogfight irrelevant was losing close-in fights to opponents flying aircraft whose basic design predated the Korean War. Something had gone fundamentally wrong, and the Air Force was only beginning to understand what it was. Against that already deeply shaken confidence, the appearance of the MiG-25 at Domodedovo in July of 1967 was not merely alarming. It was catastrophic. Intelligence analysts studying the aircraft photographs in the weeks that followed focused with particular attention on the enormous wing planform. A wing of that area, attached to an aircraft of that gross weight and fuselage configuration, indicated to every trained analyst the ability to sustain high G maneuvering turns at combat speed. The conclusion they drew was the most alarming available interpretation. The Soviets had not merely built a high-speed interceptor, they had built a Mach 3 capable dogfighter. If that assessment was correct, then every American aircraft committed to the air defense of NATO Europe was already outclassed by a Soviet machine that combined sprint capability with maneuvering performance. The pressure on the United States Air Force to produce an answer was immediate and intense, and it arrived at the worst possible moment when Vietnam was simultaneously demonstrating that the existing generation of American fighters was failing in combat in ways nobody had fully anticipated. The Air Force's response was complicated by the institutional instincts of its leadership. Senior generals in the 1960s had built their careers around strategic bombing doctrine and the delivery of nuclear weapons. Their reflexive response to any new fighter requirement was to design something large, fast, multi-mission capable, and heavy enough to carry the full range of weapons that any conceivable scenario might demand. Early concept work for what would eventually become the FX program reflected those instincts completely. Initial studies called for an aircraft weighing more than 60,000 pounds, capable of Mach 2.7, with variable geometry swing wings, essentially an improved F-111 in fighter configuration. It would have been expensive, compromised in its air superiority performance by the demands of multi-role flexibility, and fundamentally no better suited to defeat the aircraft it was supposed to counter than the F-4 had been against the MiG-17. Standing against that institutional momentum was a small group of reform-minded officers and civilian analysts who had given themselves the sardonic collective name the Fighter Mafia. Their intellectual center and driving force was Colonel John Boyd, an Air Force officer whose official career record was a long chronicle of professional friction with nearly every superior he served under. Boyd was one of the most gifted, instinctive fighter pilots of his generation. He maintained a standing personal challenge, $40 to any pilot who could maneuver into a firing position behind him within 40 seconds of the engagement beginning, and he never had to pay. But it was not his instinctive skill alone that made him transformative. It was his determination to understand that skill in rigorous analytical terms and then use that analysis to change how America built its aircraft. Working with mathematician Thomas Christie using computer time at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida that he had obtained without authorization, Boyd developed the theoretical framework he called energy maneuverability theory. The mathematics were sophisticated, but the core insight was direct. An aircraft's effectiveness in maneuvering combat was fundamentally determined by its ability to change its total energy state, the combined product of speed and altitude, more quickly than an opponent. An aircraft that could add or shed energy faster could always find angles of attack that its opponent could not deny it. By calculating these energy exchange rates for any aircraft at any speed and altitude, Boyd produced for the first time a rigorous quantitative basis for comparing aircraft combat effectiveness. When he applied this framework to American and Soviet aircraft, the results were uncomfortable for the entire Air Force establishment. The F-4 was not as dominant as its advocates claimed. The MiG-21 that was humiliating American pilots over Vietnam could outmaneuver the F-4 at specific energy states precisely because it was lighter and could redirect its energy faster. And the specifications being developed for the FX program, large, heavy, laden with multi-mission requirements, would produce an aircraft that performed better than the F-4, but fell far short of what energy maneuverability analysis indicated was achievable if the requirements were set correctly. Boyd and his circle, which included Colonel Everest Riccioni and analyst Pierre Sprey, pressed their case through the Pentagon with the kind of relentless institutional persistence that made them professionally uncomfortable to be around and professionally impossible to ignore. They met resistance at every level. Senior officers who had devoted careers to the multi-mission, heavy aircraft approach did not appreciate being told by a middle-grade colonel with unauthorized computer printouts that their aircraft were inadequate by design. Boyd was investigated for his use of unauthorized computer time at Eglin. He was passed over for promotions his record should have secured. He accumulated enemies in direct proportion to the accuracy of his analysis. None of it stopped him. He pressed the energy maneuverability findings through every available forum, briefing General Walter Sweeney at Tactical Air Command and every other senior officer he could persuade to sit in a room with him. The arguments he made were not primarily about doctrine or tactics. They were mathematical. He could show in numbers that admitted no comfortable reinterpretation precisely where American aircraft were failing and exactly what changes to the design requirements would produce an aircraft capable of winning. That specificity was what the institutional Air Force could not ultimately dismiss, even when it wanted to. The variable geometry wing was eventually dropped. The weight target was reduced substantially. The thrust-to-weight ratio requirement was driven close to 1-to-1. Boyd himself remained convinced until his death that the F-15 was still too large, too expensive, and too much the product of institutional compromise. What he could not dispute was that his theoretical framework had permanently altered the design language of American fighter aviation. While that internal debate was unfolding inside the Pentagon, the MiG-25 was making its presence felt in a way that went far beyond photographs from an air show. In March of 1971, the Soviet Air Force established the 63rd Independent Reconnaissance Aviation Squadron at Cairo West Air Base in Egypt under Colonel Alexander Bezevets, with 4 MiG-25 reconnaissance aircraft deployed in support of Soviet and Egyptian objectives in the region. On November the 6th of that same year, 2 of those aircraft flew a direct overflight of Israeli-controlled Sinai at altitudes and speeds that made interception by anything in the Israeli Air Force inventory a physical impossibility. Israeli pilots in F-4s, stripped of every pound of non-essential equipment and armed with the best radar-guided missiles available, attempted zoom climb intercepts, pulling their aircraft to 44,000 feet from a running start at Mach 1.4. The MiG-25s were still thousands of feet above them. One of those aircraft was tracked on ground radar at a speed of Mach 3.2 during the overflight. The sustained overspeed destroyed both engines, which were scrapped on landing. The pilots had pushed their aircraft beyond its operational limits to complete a mission the Israelis could not prevent. That fact, more than any airshow performance, concentrated minds in Washington. The urgency of the MiG-25 threat, arriving simultaneously with the documented failures of American aircraft in Vietnam, created conditions under which the FX program could proceed at a pace and with design requirements that the Air Force establishment would not have accepted in quieter times. 8 companies submitted initial design proposals. The field was evaluated and reduced to 3 finalists: Fairchild Republic, North American Rockwell, and McDonnell Douglas. Each received a development contract to produce detailed designs. On December 23, 1969, the Air Force announced its decision. McDonnell Douglas had won the competition. They would build the aircraft designated the F-15 Eagle. The design they proposed was radical by the standards of the day. Its wing was fixed, not variable geometry, and at 608 square feet, it was substantially larger than any contemporary American fighter wing. That area gave the aircraft a combat wing loading of approximately 73 pounds per square foot, far lower than the F-4 and significantly better for sustained turning performance at the altitudes where air combat actually occurred. Its 2 Pratt & Whitney F-100 afterburning turbofan engines, each producing approximately 23,800 pounds of thrust with afterburner, gave the complete aircraft a thrust-to-weight ratio greater than 1:1 at combat weight. No production fighter in history had achieved that figure. It meant the F-15 could accelerate while pointing vertically upward. The cockpit was enclosed by a single-piece, blown acrylic bubble canopy providing nearly complete 360-degree visibility, eliminating the sectors of obscured vision that had allowed opponents to approach American aircraft unseen over Vietnam. The entire cockpit was organized around the principle called hands-on throttle and stick. Every switch the pilot needed during a combat engagement, radar mode selection, weapon system control, electronic countermeasures, navigation and radio functions, was located on either the throttle grip or the control stick, so that a pilot fighting at close range and high G-loading would never have to look down at the instrument panel to perform any essential function. The Air Force also imposed a discipline on the program that was unusual and deliberate. The F-15 would carry no air-to-ground attack capability. The program's stated philosophy was unambiguous: not a pound for air-to-ground. This was not popular with every part of the Air Force, which had always valued multi-mission flexibility and resented any aircraft that could not be pressed into strike roles if the operational situation demanded it. But the discipline held, and it was the most consequential single decision in the program's history. Every capability added to a fighter aircraft adds weight, adds wiring, adds systems that require maintenance, and introduces compromises in the aircraft's optimization for its primary mission. The F-15 refused every such addition. It would do one thing with total commitment: own the sky. The first F-15A completed its maiden flight on July 27, 1972, at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Test pilots who flew it in the months that followed described an experience that demanded complete retraining of the instincts built in less capable machines. In the F-4, you preserved energy with care because there was never quite enough of it to waste. In the F-15, the problem was almost the reverse. The aircraft climbed at rates exceeding 50,000 feet per minute. Its service ceiling reached approximately 65,000 feet. At the altitudes where maneuvering combat actually took place, it could outturn, out-accelerate, and out-sustain any contemporary opponent in a prolonged engagement. The aircraft's radar reinforced its physical advantages. The Hughes AN/AP G63 was the first fighter radar in American service with genuine look-down, shoot-down performance against low-flying targets. Previous radar systems had been seriously degraded when searching for aircraft at low altitude, because radar energy bouncing back from the terrain below created overwhelming returns that masked the weaker returns from the target. The APG-63's pulse Doppler signal processing separated the Doppler-shifted returns from a moving aircraft against the essentially stationary ground below, allowing it to detect and track a fighter-sized contact at ranges approaching 85 nautical miles, regardless of how low the target was flying. It could maintain simultaneous track files on multiple contacts while continuing to search the surrounding airspace. From 1979 onward, the radar incorporated a software programmable signal processor, meaning new operating modes and new weapons compatibility could be added through software rather than replacing hardware. The architecture was built for continuous evolution across decades of service. The first operational F-15 was delivered to the 1st Tactical Fighter Wing at Langley Air Force Base on January 9, 1976. American pilots who flew it for the first time described a fundamental change in the quality of the flying experience. After years of careful energy management in the F-4, flying an aircraft whose margin for error in maneuvering combat was narrow, the F-15 felt as though it had been engineered to make a skilled pilot nearly invincible. The margins it provided in every dimension of performance were unlike anything previously available in American service. The remaining question was what it would prove under conditions where the consequences of failure were not lower exercise scores, but lost aircraft and lost lives. That question found its answer, as so many Cold War aviation questions did, not over the anticipated battleground of Central Europe, but in the skies of the Middle East. Israel received its first F-15s at Tel Nof Air Base on December 10, 1976, an event whose political significance was immediate and dramatic. The aircraft arrived late on a Friday evening, and their appearance past sundown into the Sabbath triggered a religious political controversy that led directly to an Agudat Yisrael no-confidence motion against the Rabin government, which dissolved parliament on December 22, 1976. Israeli air crews named the aircraft the Baz, the Hebrew word for falcon. The Israeli Air Force flew in an environment that left no room for treating air combat as a peacetime training exercise. Real aircraft from real adversary nations flew real missions across contested borders, and the consequences of inferior preparation were measured in pilot lives and national survival. Israeli pilots pushed the F-15 harder and more continuously than any other operators, testing its boundaries in exercises that other air forces would have considered extreme. On June 27, 1979, that preparation met its first real test. 4 F-15 from 133 Squadron were directed by a Grumman E-2C Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft toward a formation of Syrian MiG-21s over southern Lebanon near Sidon. The flight was led by Squadron Commander Lieutenant Colonel Benny Zinker. Flying as his wingman was Major Moshe Melnik, already a 5.5 kill ace from his time flying F-4s in earlier conflicts. Melnik fired an Israeli-manufactured Python 3 infrared missile and destroyed a MiG-21. It was the first aerial kill in the F-15's history. Within roughly 60 seconds, the engagement had expanded across the formation. 4 Syrian aircraft were destroyed in the same engagement, each by a different weapon system. One by an AEM-7F Sparrow radar-guided missile, one by an AEM-9G Sidewinder infrared missile, one by cannon fire from the M61 Vulcan, and one by the Python 3 Melnik had fired in the opening seconds. 4 different weapons, 4 kills, under 60 seconds. The aircraft born from Vietnam's missile disasters had just demonstrated in actual combat that every one of those disasters had been studied, understood, and corrected. The record grew steadily. On February 13, 1981, Lieutenant Colonel Benny Zinker, flying F-15A Baz 672 from 133 Squadron, fired 3 AIM-7F Sparrow missiles at extended range and destroyed a Syrian MiG-25 over Lebanon. The aircraft built specifically to answer the Foxbat had killed 1. Less than 4 months later, on June 7th, F-15 escorts flew top cover for 8 F-16 drawn from both 117 Squadron and 110 Squadron during Operation Opera, the Israeli strike that destroyed Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor. The F-15s held the airspace open and no Iraqi aircraft penetrated the formation. The escort accomplished its purpose completely by never firing a single shot. The most significant demonstration of what the F-15 had become came on June 9, 1982, in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon. The Israeli Air Force executed an integrated air operation of extraordinary sophistication. Unmanned aircraft induced Syrian surface-to-air missile batteries to activate their guidance radars. Electronic warfare platforms mapped those signals and jammed them with precision that left Syrian air defense controllers looking at blank screens. Then Israeli F-15s and F-16s swept through the contested airspace. 29 Syrian aircraft were destroyed on the opening day alone, with no Israeli losses. Over the course of the Lebanon campaign, approximately 82 Syrian aircraft were destroyed in air-to-air combat by Israeli fighters. Soviet military advisors embedded with Syrian forces watched the weapons systems and tactical doctrine they had provided be dismantled by an opponent who had understood it more thoroughly than its designers had anticipated. The Soviet deputy commander of the Air Force was dispatched personally to assess what had happened. From the first engagement in June of 1979 through the Lebanon campaign of 1982, Israeli F-15s had accumulated approximately 58 confirmed aerial victories against Syrian aircraft without a single air-to-air loss. But the most strategically important event in the F-15 story had taken place before any of those kills were scored. It had occurred on a September morning in 1976 at a civilian airport in northern Japan, and it had involved no missiles, no radar engagements, and no combat of any kind. Lieutenant Viktor Belenko of the 513th Fighter Regiment of the Soviet Air Defense Forces departed Chugyevka Air Base near Vladivostok on September 6, 1976, on a training flight logged in the standard way. He descended immediately to approximately 100 feet above the terrain, low enough to remain beneath Soviet radar coverage, and flew east for roughly 400 miles at low altitude across Soviet territory. He then climbed into Japanese airspace. Japanese ground radar detected him. 2 F-4 Phantoms of the Japan Air Self-Defense Force were scrambled to intercept. He evaded them. With his fuel approaching exhaustion and his intended destination at Chitose Air Base unreachable, he diverted to Hakodate Civilian Airport, landed without clearance, overran the runway by approximately 240 meters, and damaged the nose gear on touchdown. He exited the cockpit with his service pistol and fired warning shots into the air to disperse civilians who had moved toward the aircraft with cameras. He then requested political asylum from Japanese authorities. President Gerald Ford granted that asylum within days. Central Intelligence Agency Director George Herbert Walker Bush publicly described the event as an intelligence bonanza. On September 25th, a United States Air Force C-5A Galaxy transport flew the disassembled aircraft from Hakodate to Hyakuri Air Base, where teams of American and Japanese engineers and technical analysts spent the following weeks conducting the most thorough examination of a Soviet military aircraft Western intelligence had ever conducted. The engineers moved through the aircraft systematically, removing every accessible component, measuring every structural element, and testing every system against the intelligence assessments that had been built up over years of external observation. What they found dismantled a decade of threat assessments in a matter of days. The MiG-25 was not what Western analysts had believed it to be. Its airframe was approximately 80% nickel-steel alloy, held together by welds whose seam lines ran visibly along the exterior skin in patterns that Western photo interpreters had occasionally and incorrectly attributed to battle damage or field repairs. Titanium, the high-performance alloy fundamental to American high-speed aircraft construction, made up only about 9% of the MiG-25 structure. Soviet industrial capability in the 1960s had been unable to weld titanium at the scale the design would have required. The engineers at Mikoyan had used welded stainless steel throughout most of the primary structure instead. It was heavy, crude by Western standards, and enormously strong in the specific ways the design demanded, but it was not the material of an aircraft built for agility and sustained maneuvering combat. The radar, the Smerch-A, weighed more than 1,000 pounds and was built from vacuum tubes, a technology that Western aviation had abandoned in favor of transistors years earlier. Its effective detection range against a fighter-sized target was roughly 50 to 60 miles. The twin Tumansky R-15 turbojet engines were governed by a hard operational speed limit. Above Mach 2.83, sustained operation would destroy them. The Mach 3.2 tracking datum from the Sinai overflight had not been a combat performance demonstration. It had been an emergency situation that killed the engines and required their disposal on landing. The aircraft's practical maneuvering capability in any combat scenario was far below what those enormous wings had led Western intelligence to assume. The MiG-25's absolute structural limit in maneuvering flight was 4.5 times the force of gravity. But with a full fuel load, the usable maneuvering envelope was constrained to approximately 2.2 times the force of gravity. An aircraft limited to 2.2 G in maneuvering flight was not a dogfighter. It was fundamentally incapable of the sustained high G turning combat that air superiority required. The huge wing had not been designed for agility. It had been sized to generate the lift needed to get a very heavy aircraft to extreme altitude. Nothing more. The aircraft had been designed in direct response to a specific American threat that the United States had itself cancelled before the MiG-25 entered service. The North American XB-70 Valkyrie, a Mach 3 strategic nuclear bomber whose operational profile would have made Soviet air defense intercepts genuinely difficult, had been abandoned by the American government in the early 1960s as strategic doctrine shifted from high-altitude bomber penetration toward ballistic missiles and low-level penetration. The United States had moved on, the Soviets had not. Their designers continued and completed the MiG-25 regardless, redirecting its purpose somewhat toward the interception of high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft and any future high-speed bomber threat that might emerge. The result was a single-mission interceptor whose entire performance envelope was optimized for one thing: reaching a specific altitude at maximum speed, firing a specific set of missiles at slow-moving or unescorted targets that could not evade them, and returning to base. Against a maneuvering fighter in close combat, it was essentially helpless. Against a nuclear bomber cruising at extreme altitude with no fighter escort, it was devastating. But against the aircraft that the Western Alliance was actually operating and training to fly, it was far less than the threat that had driven American procurement policy for nearly a decade. Western intelligence had spent those years building threat assessments, writing acquisition requirements, drafting doctrine, and committing billions of dollars to responding to an aircraft they had fundamentally mischaracterized. The MiG-25 was never the weapon they had described, but here is the irony that defines this entire story. The aircraft built in response to that mischaracterization was not merely adequate. The F-15 Eagle was transformationally superior to every adversary it would face in actual combat, including the MiG-25 itself. The most comprehensive proof arrived during Operation Desert Storm between January 17 and February 28, 1991. F-15C, Eagles of the 33rd, 1st, and 36th. Tactical fighter wings flew combat air patrol and offensive counter-air sweeps from bases in Saudi Arabia against the Iraqi Air Force, which fielded MiG-29s, MiG-25s, MiG-23s, Mirage F-1s, and other Soviet and French-supplied aircraft in what was the largest Arab air force ever assembled for combat. In the opening minutes of the air war, Captain John Kelk of the 58th Tactical Fighter Squadron fired an AIM-7M Sparrow radar-guided missile at an Iraqi MiG-29 and destroyed it. The first aerial kill of the conflict had been scored before most of the world knew the air campaign had begun. In the minutes that followed, other F-15 crews engaged additional Iraqi aircraft in what became the most one-sided opening sequence of air battles in modern military history. Over the weeks that followed, United States Air Force F-15Cs accumulated approximately 34 air-to-air victories, covering MiG-29s, MiG-25s, MiG-23s, Mirage F-1s, and other types. A substantial number of those kills were achieved at beyond visual range, validating the radar and missile doctrine that Vietnam had so comprehensively discredited. The radar worked as designed. The missiles guided as intended. The pilots, trained through red flag and the doctrinal innovations that the Alt report had demanded, were superior to their opponents in situation awareness, tactical execution, and weapons employment. Saudi Arabian F-15 pilot Captain Ayahid Salah al-Shamrani added 2 further Mirage F-1 kills on January 24. By the campaign's end, the F-15 family held an air-to-air combat record across American, Israeli, and Saudi service of over 100 confirmed victories against 0 air-to-air losses, a ratio without precedent in the history of jet-powered combat aviation. The aircraft continued to evolve long after it had established that record. The single-seat F-15C and two-seat F-15D entered United States Air Force service in 1979, carrying conformal fuel tanks, increased internal fuel capacity, and a maximum takeoff weight increased to 68,000 pounds. The conformal tanks, long aerodynamic pods mounted along the engine intake trunks, rather than suspended from wing pylons, added roughly 10,000 pounds of fuel to the C model's endurance, while generating significantly less aerodynamic drag than conventional external stores. That same year, the APG-63 received the software programmable signal processor that established the pattern of continuous capability improvement through software that would characterize the radar across its entire service life. McDonnell Douglas and Hughes Aircraft, without government funding, developed a dedicated two-seat deep strike variant drawing on the same fundamental airframe. That self-funded effort produced the F-15E Strike Eagle, selected by the Air Force on February 24, 1984, over the competing General Dynamics F-16XL in the dual-role fighter competition. The Strike Eagle entered service in 1989, carrying an updated APG-70 radar, low-altitude navigation and targeting infrared for night sensor pods, terrain-following flight control integration, ring laser gyro inertial navigation, and a maximum takeoff weight of approximately 81,000 pounds. It replaced much of the F-111 fleet in the deep strike role, becoming the aircraft that could own the sky in the morning and put precision weapons on hardened targets in the afternoon. International variants followed in subsequent decades. The F-15E for Israel, the F-15S and F-15SA for Saudi Arabia, the F-15K for South Korea, the F-15SG for Singapore, the F-15J built under license by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in Japan. Today, the F-15EX Eagle II is in production at the same Boeing facility in St. Louis, Missouri, where the original F-15A was assembled more than 5 decades ago. It carries an active electronically scanned array radar and an advanced electronic warfare system that its designers in 1969 could not have imagined. The airframe born from the fear of a misread Soviet aircraft is still being manufactured, still being upgraded, and still regarded by serious analysts as one of the most capable air superiority platforms in existence. The deeper question, and the one this history ultimately poses, is what the F-15's success reveals about how genuine military capability is actually created. The lessons are not the ones that institutional experience alone would suggest, and they apply well beyond the narrow domain of fighter aircraft procurement. The first is that honest confrontation with documented failure drives more important advances than ambition or competitive pressure. The F-15 was not the product of an institution that had decided to aspire to something higher than what it already possessed. It was the product of an institution forced to confront by the recorded and undeniable evidence of an ongoing war that its foundational approach to air combat was failing at the operational level where lives depended on it. The Alt report, the Navy's rigorous internal study documenting a 9% kill probability for the AM-7 Sparrow in actual combat conditions over Vietnam, was not a comfortable document to write or to receive. Its authors could have softened its findings and preserved the institutional comfort of believing that existing equipment was essentially sound. They chose instead to document what the evidence showed. That honesty created the intellectual conditions for fundamental change. The Air Force's parallel Red Baron studies extended that indictment across the entire doctrine of missile-only, beyond visual range combat. From those documents of institutional failure came the Navy Fighter Weapons School at Naval Air Station Miramar, established March 3, 1969, and the Air Force Red Flag exercises at Nellis Air Force Base. Both programs rebuilt American air combat capability from foundations that Vietnam had revealed as inadequate, measuring training against the hard standards of actual combat rather than the comfortable standards of peacetime administration. The second lesson is that theoretical honesty is more powerful than accumulated conventional wisdom. Boyd's energy maneuverability framework gave the F-15 program a rigorous mathematical basis for what a winning fighter aircraft actually needed to be, something that decades of operational experience had never delivered, because operational experience works within existing paradigms rather than questioning them. That framework produced the high thrust-to-weight ratio and low wing loading that define the Eagle, characteristics that the institutional Air Force would not have arrived at through its normal processes. Theory said to build fast, agile, and specialized. Institutional experience said to build large, flexible, and multi-mission capable. Theory produced the aircraft that accumulated over 100 aerial victories against 0 air-to-air losses across decades of combat. The third lesson is that the discipline to refuse is as important as the capability to build. The decision to strip ground attack capability from the F-15 entirely, held against sustained opposition from the parts of the Air Force that valued multi-role flexibility and fought for it through the entire development program, was the most consequential single-discipline decision in the aircraft's history. Every added mission requirement adds weight, adds wiring, adds maintenance demands, and dilutes the optimization of every other system for its primary purpose. The F-15 refused every such dilution. It was built for one mission with complete and uncompromised dedication to that mission. It became the best at that mission in the history of aviation, and that outcome was inseparable from the discipline that produced it. The fourth and most paradoxical lesson is that a wrong assessment, pursued with genuine discipline and intellectual honesty about the underlying problem, even when mistaken about the specific threat, can produce a better outcome than the right assessment would have allowed. A correct understanding of the MiG-25 in 1967 would have produced an incremental American response. Marginal improvements to existing aircraft and missile systems. Continued commitment to multi-role heavy aircraft philosophy. Nothing requiring the institutional disruption and radical departure from convention that produced the F-15. The incorrect understanding created an emergency that bypassed the conservatism those conventional preferences generated, forced difficult and uncomfortable decisions, and produced an aircraft that the actual threat, correctly analyzed, could never have justified building. The phantom threat generated something real and extraordinary that the real threat would not have demanded. That paradox is this story's most important fact because it means the F-15 was not inevitable. It was accidental in origin, disciplined in execution, and extraordinary in outcome. The MiG-25 that started this entire sequence left service with the Russian Air Force reconnaissance fleet in 2013, more than 4 decades after it had first alarmed the West at Domodedovo. The F-15 Eagle remains in production. Viktor Belenko spent the rest of his life in the United States, working in the aerospace industry, whose most capable air superiority product, his defection, had helped vindicate, living as a free man in the country whose fear of his former aircraft had produced the Eagle he had never flown but had irrevocably shaped. The aircraft he flew across the Sea of Japan was carefully disassembled by American and Japanese engineers over several weeks at Hyakuri Air Base, returned to Soviet authorities in 30 crates aboard the freighter Taigonos in November of 1976, and found to be missing approximately 20 components the Soviets were unable to account for. The engineers who had taken it apart had learned more from it than the Soviets realized, and what they had learned confirmed, in precise technical detail, everything that the F-15 program had been designed to address. There is something nearly symmetrical in the full arc of this history. The Soviets built an aircraft to intercept an American bomber that America had cancelled before the interceptor was finished. America panicked over that interceptor because it misread what it saw at an air show and drew the wrong conclusions from a wing. The panic produced a fighter of genuine and lasting excellence that outlasted the Cold War, outlasted the aircraft it was built to counter, and is still in production today. That fighter shot down the very aircraft that had provoked its creation in the skies above Lebanon, in the hands of pilots who understood both types and knew precisely what each could and could not do. And the pilot who had flown the feared aircraft, who understood better than any Western analyst what it actually was, made one long low-level flight east across Soviet territory and landed in Japan, handing the answer to the country whose fear had built his replacement. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon is not the one your adversary possesses. It is the one you believe he possesses. That belief, if it is sufficiently focused, and the institutional response it generates, if it is sufficiently disciplined and honest about the real problem underneath the perceived threat, can produce something that the actual threat never warranted, and the actual adversary never anticipated, and never could have matched. The F-15 Eagle is the permanent record of that truth. The aircraft born from a misread photograph and a decade of compounding fear became the standard against which every air superiority fighter designed since has been measured, a standard that has not been exceeded in combat across more than 50 years of operational service. More than half a century after its first flight, it is still being built, still being upgraded, and still defining what it means to own the sky. It earned that standing not through luck or accident or the simple weight of American industrial capacity, but through the systematic and sometimes deeply uncomfortable application of lessons that needed to be learned, by people who refused to pretend the old answers remained sufficient when the evidence in front of them said otherwise.